Night. Getting all this stuff. Yeah, no, while you're at it. Think about it. Would you mind? Hold here. Those springs are nothing. Monday, March 12th, 2018. We have some presentations and reports this evening. We're going to begin with the Independence Square Main Street Program update. Mr. City Manager?
Yes, Madam Mayor, members of the Council, your strategic plan, Independence for All, of course, focused on growth. One of the items we funded in the current fiscal year was a partnership with the Independence Square Association, specifically to help them get enrolled in the Missouri Main Street program and develop around the concepts of the Main Street 4-point approach. We've had a lot of success with that partnership, and as that did involve a contract, we wanted to bring Jeff and Cindy Rogers, co-executive directors of the Independence Square Association, here tonight to let you know about the success of that program and where we see that moving forward. So I would ask Jeff and Cindy, or Jeff it looks like tonight. I just put them together, so Jeff, it's all yours.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Yeah, Cindy sends her hellos. She's down at South by Southwest.
Oh,
so
darn.
yeah.
Too bad. I feel sorry
Poor
for
her. Yeah. I just wanted to kind of bring you up to speed with what's been going on. For most of you know a little bit about the Main Street program. We're a part of the affiliate grant this year. There's only a few organizations that are chosen each year for that, and so we feel very fortunate to be a part of that program. We have already used that to restructure how we meet, the committees that we're a part of, and so we're broken into the 4 points as 4 different committees that meet. We have a board member who is the chair of each of those different committee groups, and they're structured around organization, design, promotion, and economic development. And so they're starting on their way. We've got a national conference of Main Street organizations that happens later this month. It'll be March 26th, 27th, and 28th. That'll be in downtown Kansas City. And so people from all over the nation will be coming for part of that conference. We have at least 6, looks like now 7 of our board members will be in attendance at that conference, which is quite exciting. It helps to get them acclimated to the Main Street approach, and it also gives us a chance to network with other people who have done this process before, those who've been very successful with it, and equally those who may be stumbled, and help us avoid some of those stumbles ourselves. So we're looking forward to that piece. As part of that, we've got a mobile workshop coming to Independence from the conference, and that'll take place on that Monday. We'll start off at the Truman Library, where a person or 2 from our tourism department will greet the tour bus. They'll spend about 30 minutes with them, kind of just giving them some highlights about Independence, sharing some cool handouts for them, and then they'll tour the library for a little bit. I will join them after their library tour, bring them up to the square, tell them a little bit about our organization, some of the cool things that we've got going on, show them how far we've come up with the farmers market, for example. And then the workshop will spend their afternoon eating on the square and discovering some of the other things that exist up there. So it should be a lot of fun. In preparation for that, hopefully later this week we'll be planting our spring flowers along the square, so you'll see that spruce up start to happen, which will be nice. We're trying to also keep people focused on cleaning up around the square. The winds lately seem to have brought their share of trash with them. Some of our trash cans are now missing the tops, and so strong winds also tend to whip that out, and so we're trying to encourage people to remember, when you see something, just stop, pick it up, so we can keep our area nice and clean for the patrons up there. A lot of the workshops that are going to be happening, some cool things, workshops on tax credits, on grants that are available to downtown organizations, on community engagement, on filling empty storefronts. So a lot of different, really, we see very lucrative workshops for our board members. This all happens right before our town hall meeting, which is a part of the Main Street program. On April 10th, we'll be having a town hall. I think we'll be having it in the banquet room at Ophelia's. We'll be sending invitations out later this week and the first part of next week to different key stakeholders, property owners. You'll all receive an invitation to that town hall. Neighborhood leaders. Scott, I was interested in the council meeting last week. You had mentioned having the neighborhood association forum, and I would love to be able to get invitations out to each of those neighborhood association leaders to be a part of this meeting as well if they'd like to. I'm talking to several service clubs, trying to get some of their members here as well, so Rotary, Kiwanis, that type of thing. And then neighbors, we'll be reaching out to the local neighborhood associations definitely around the square, but we'll be inviting other neighborhoods from across the city as well, knowing that the square is a landing point for many people in our city, and we want their input as we begin to grow and create plans for what we should be. Let's see, so that evening will be partly everyone gathered learning about the Main Street concept. It'll be led by Missouri Main Street. Keith Winge will be leading that evening. And then we'll be breaking into, again, those 4 different points, letting people kind of gravitate to where they'd like to be and provide their ideas and feedback in each of those areas. So that seems like a lot of fun. And then the last thing I'm going to throw out, we've got some other initiatives that we're doing that are new this year. We've just partnered with the Truman Library for an Easter event. So on March 31st, we will be having an Easter egg roll on the lawn of the Truman Library. We're extremely excited about that. First time that that's happened. We're calling it Harry's Hop and Hunt, bringing the White House Easter egg roll to Independence. And so we'll be reaching out throughout the metro area, encouraging people to come. We've got a website already set up for people to kind of RSVP. We're just trying to gauge approximate attendance. So there'll be an Easter egg roll, there'll be an Easter egg hunts, there will be story reading time, there will be just a lot of different activities on the lawn. We'll end with a car processional to the square led by the Easter Bunny himself, where we'll encourage people to stop in one of our cafes, restaurants for lunch, and then do a family scavenger hunt throughout our shops. They'll be looking for Easter egg hunt trivia as it relates to the Truman era and also just to the White House in general. So it should be a fun afternoon, a great partnership with the Truman Library, and we look forward to really growing that event.
Great.
Any questions?
Well, that happened really quickly. I was
That
just
did.
talking to Dr. Graham about a week ago, and he was sort of saying, we should recreate the White House Easter egg roll. I said, well, yeah, that would be great. I didn't know he was talking about doing it this year.
Well, Cindy and I have been dreaming about this for a year now.
Yeah.
And when they have a new kind of community liaison, and she was extremely excited about it when she heard about it, and she said, yeah, let's go ahead and do it.
Yeah.
So
Terrific.
we're a little shaky right now. March 31st, so the day before Easter, the Saturday before Easter.
Yeah.
That morning from 10 to probably noon, and everyone is invited. It'll be a great time. We'll have music there, just a fun morning for families to enjoy an Easter egg roll.
Great. Are there comments or questions from the council regarding Main Street? Yes.
Well, not really. I'm thinking about your Easter egg roll. Mike Dittemore, Chief, you might mention to Mike Dittemore to get his rabbit outfit out of the closet. Last time I saw him, he was dressed all in pink. That would be a good addition.
Well, we definitely will have an Easter bunny, but we can use more than one bunny, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Chief, that's your son.
Very good assignment. Other comments or questions from the council? Yes, Councilman.
That's not an Easter bunny, that's Ralphie.
That's right. Yes, that is Ralphie. That was for Christmas. Get your rabbits.
It'll work.
I just want to say, I mean, we have talked about being involved with the Main Street program for a long time and have sort of, you know, obviously haven't done it until now. And I think there was maybe some hesitation because we didn't want to pick, you know, between the square and Englewood and some other areas of town who may be interested in doing this. But really, you know, we've discovered that we don't have to pick. I mean, that we can do some things here on the square and we can do other things in other parts of town. So that's very exciting. And, you know, also we didn't have the leadership that you and Cindy provide. And so I want to thank you very much for
You're welcome.
the role that you are playing, not only with Main Street, but everything that we're doing with downtown redevelopment and Independence. I mean, your skills and your abilities have really made a huge difference. So I'm very excited that we are, you know, finally found the right opportunity to pursue this, because there really is a lot to be gained and then a lot to give.
We believe that too. As we, you know, embark with the farmers market, we don't want to have that, you know, build it and they'll come attitude. We want to make sure that we're proactive in leveraging that and other focus, that we do create economic development that radiates out. So that is a focus of ours.
And I think you make an excellent point. The square belongs to everybody. Everybody loves the downtown area. It's our gathering place. So I would certainly encourage people as we go through this process as a city to feel included, that this doesn't for the square, about the square, that is really, you know, is a jumping off point for a lot of things in our community. So
Exactly.
we'll certainly help to spread the word the best we can about the town hall meeting and make sure that people feel welcome and included to come and participate
Great.
in that.
That'll be April 10th.
Okay, thank you. Thanks,
Thank
Jeff.
you.
Okay, next we have the compensation study report. Mr. Sanders.
Yes, Madam Mayor, members of the council, continue to feel like a broken record, but your Independence for All strategic plan, really focusing on financial sustainability. We talked about doing as one of our strategies, a citywide classification and compensation study, and that was again an item that was funded in this year's current budget. So after a tremendous amount of effort and work, not only by our consultant, but by really all levels of this organization and our friends and our labor organizations, we have a product that we're now ready to roll out to the council and begin sharing that with you. So at this time I'd like to introduce Deborah Craig, Director of HR, who will introduce our presentation further.
Thank you.
Good evening, Mayor, members of the council. In April 2017, is that?
Yeah,
It's
pretty there. That might be better.
In April 2017, the city received 6 responses to our request for proposal for a consultant for classification and compensation study for jobs at the City of Independence. One of those responses was from Gallagher Benefit Services HR and Compensation Consulting Division. Arthur J. Gallagher and Company was founded in 1927 and is currently the world's 4th largest insurance brokerage and risk management services firm. The project team for Gallagher was led by Gail Merriweather, our guest tonight, Area Vice President of HR Consulting Services. Ms. Merriweather has more than 20 years of experience with compensation consulting. She has extensive experience in designing and implementing compensation systems, job analysis, job evaluations, external market analysis, and salary structure design. Some of Gallagher's clients include, and references include, City of Hutchinson, Kansas, City of Olathe, City of Topeka, City of Kirkwood, Missouri, City of Stafford, Texas, Board of Public Utilities, Unified Government of Wyandotte County, the State of Rhode Island. The last time the compensation structure for the City of Independence was formally conducted was in 1997. So we are very excited because we believe this plan will provide consistency in applying compensation decisions and clarity when regarding external market. So, Gail?
Thank you.
Good evening. I trust everybody's doing well. My name is Gail Merriweather. I'm going to peek up just a little bit and tell me your name. Okay, Meg. Meg will be responsible for making sure then that I get through at a pace that's reasonable. And so I don't want to take too much time, so Meg, we'll just go ahead and get started. Talk a little bit about the process, which we believe is very important. So one of the most important things that we did was to conduct individual interviews with each of the department directors. Most of them are over there, so I'm going to have to keep an eye on them because they didn't all get what they wanted. We also spent some time with the union representatives as well. That was really important for us because we wanted to understand what their concerns were around compensation. What had they been dealing with, especially considering that you had not done a formal review for 20 years. So we asked a series of questions consistently across each of them. Who do they compete with for talent? Are there positions that have been tough for them to fill? We just wanted to make sure that we thoroughly understood. And we had similar conversations with union representatives as well at the very start of the process. The questions were the same. Who do they feel that they compete with talent, for talent? What was going on as it relates to compensation? We asked them to identify similar municipalities that they lose or recruit employees from and to. We inquired as to whether or not they competed in the private sector, in the nonprofit sector. And after we'd gained all of that information, we developed what we like to call a position description questionnaire. That was also important as well because that gave each employee the opportunity to participate in the process. They were asked to complete those PDQs, for short, explaining their roles and responsibilities here at the City of Independence, from what their work is, what level of experience is required, what knowledge is required to get that job done, a bunch of the ADA kinds of questions as well, because these PDQs will eventually be rewritten into job descriptions. So from top to bottom, we had that participation, and everybody was eager to participate. After we'd gone through that process, then we conducted the market analysis. The goal was really to basically 3 parts: to understand externally what are other people paying for similar jobs in the marketplace, and then internally to make sure that we understood internal equity, those positions that were similarly situated and are paid consistently or similarly in the marketplace, that they would be treated the same in a new compensation structure. And then finally, we wanted to make sure that we developed a salary administration manual that would be easy for the city to be able to administer the process going through. Continuously, I said, if I hit the lottery and decide I'm not going to come back to work, I wanted to make sure that the process and everything that we brought back would be really simple for the HR department to kind of carry forward. So with that, if there are any questions that you have, please feel free to stop me, because the other thing I say is that when you're as close to 60 as I am, you'll forget your question. So I don't want you to forget your question. Just stop me and ask that question. But it's also important to understand, where did we look to make sure that we understood the external market? So I won't go through all of these, but it was really important for us to understand the data in the American Public Power Association, the water systems as well, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, comp data, Mid-America Regional Council. We also looked at Towers. Towers Watson is a series of surveys that we buy on an annual basis. That was important to us because I'd also promised that even if the city only had one level of complexity, so basically if the city had one accountant position in the entire city, we would bring back data for each of those levels as we see them in the market survey. So it may be accountant 1, 2, 3, and 4, or a senior accountant, a specialist, because we anticipate that the structure will grow with the city as well. So then when there's an inquisition as to what would be the next promotional opportunity, that market data is available. So we've left the city with what we like to call levels of complexity. So as another example, over at the electric company for electrical engineers, now we have the data for electrical engineers 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s, up through level 5, an engineering supervisor and a manager. That way there's no guessing about which level a job should be in. It would be strictly a function of the market data. Okay? We looked at a number of municipalities as well. And let me do say, Leawood has not moved to Missouri. It's still in Kansas. That was my mistake. But we looked at municipalities because we wanted to make sure that when we looked at the fire department, we understood which of those municipalities are part of their bargaining agreement when they go through with negotiations. So we looked at those municipalities. We asked the same at police. We just asked a series of questions, and this is the list. You'll notice that both Columbia, Missouri and Springfield, Missouri are there, and that's because they have power companies as well. I've done some work for the city of Kirkwood. Theirs is a little bit smaller, so we didn't include theirs. Okay? So then, I'm going to slow down just a little bit because doing this for almost 25 years, I know it, so I have a tendency to go fast. So what I want you to focus on now is all of those surveys and municipalities that we just flipped through. Think about data. So from every survey, every piece of data that I can get, I get it. We age it to a common effective date. So let's go back to an electrical engineer. So I know that there's data in towers. There's going to be data from each of the municipalities. So I'm just dealing with numbers. I'll grab them all, and then I'll age them, and we'll say, okay, for an electrical engineering 2, this is about what pay should be. So even though you all have 405 job classifications, we probably had data points that may have been about 700 or 800 numbers that I'm dealing with because of the different levels of complexity. So then the next goal is to sort it out so that we can develop structures. And how do we do that so that we are consistent? And it's a simple process. We look for natural breaks. So I've got this little short exercise. So pretend those 4 data points that you see is representative of, let's say, those maybe 1,000 numbers that we had to deal with. So the question always becomes, if I had all of these numbers from $37,678 to $75,921, what happens if I grouped and averaged them all together and said they belong all in the same range? Can anybody tell me, just about, you can ballpark, what would that average be? Ballpark. I'll give you a hint.
And it divided by 4?
And it would be 50-something.
I think it'd be 50.
Yes, perfect. It's going to be about 50-something. And so then we have to establish what is the minimum and what would the maximum be, because we don't want to say definitively, you have to pay that employee this amount of money, because we don't know exactly how they match up with their job duties with every other municipality or every other data point in the survey, so we establish a range. And what we've done is the typical ranges that you'll see in the marketplace. It's a 50% range spread, 20 percentage points on either side. So if we would have just averaged those 4 data points with a midpoint of 50, the minimum would have been about 40, the maximum would have been about 60. Now, had we slid that job of which the market says the pay is $37,000, had we put it back in that same range, it would have looked like you were underpaying that position, but you weren't. And the same with the job for $75,000. If we put that job back in, it would look like, oh my, you know, we're like way overpaying this job. So this is just simply to say the $37,000 and the $39,000 jobs, they should be in the same range. The $45,000 job should be in a range, and the $75,000 should be in a range. That's how we developed each of those ranges. And then we put the jobs back in the ranges. Then we called HR and said, can we get all of the employees' names, their job titles, and their pay? And we ran an analysis to kind of see where's the city paying. This was for the non-represented groups. For the represented groups, it was a little bit different because those are the positions wherein there's a dollar amount that's been negotiated that you have to base those decisions on. For those jobs, what we simply did was say this is what we believe the market is, and this would be a reasonable max or a reasonable min. Questions so far? Did I lose everybody?
Almost. Can you go back, what was the 115% at the bottom there?
I didn't say yet, so Mr. Van Kemp, you're good. Here we go. So let's pretend that John Doe makes his salary is $44,597, okay? But the market for his job is right around $39,854. And that's because he's been doing this job for 25 years. When I put that job back into the structure, I compare John Doe's $44,000 to the midpoint of the range, 38, because that's about where the market is. And what we find is John Doe is paid about 15 percentage points higher than the market. So we like to call that a comp ratio. So his comp ratio is about 115%.
So he gets a higher, he's getting less than what you think he should, but he's getting more by the 15%.
He's getting more.
In comparison
Yes.
to,
Yes. But he's not maxed out, though. Not yet.
not by a lot.
Yeah, not yet. And that's not unusual, especially if somebody's been in that same job for like 25, 30 years, and they've been getting the same typical salary increase, then that's going to be about what we would see. Now, I know the answer. One more. Hold it right there, okay, because I might need you to go back. When we put all of the employees back in for the City of Independence, the overall average comp ratio is about 93%, which means you're paying about 93% of the market. And that's reasonable.
According to the status that you have over the data.
Yes,
Did you do a two-tail or did you just leave it straight?
it's straight. However, it is 2 standard deviations from that midpoint. And, well, 2 standard deviations, we believe, or the OFCCP has decided that if pay is within those 2 standard deviations, then it's probably reasonable.
And a standard deviation is 4, right?
5, 10 on each side. Because of the market, the OFCCP has decided what's the norm within the marketplace, and a 50% range spread is the norm within the marketplace. Mr. Van Camp, it feels like we should go to lunch.
When I worked for the state as a revenue agent, they had somebody like your company go through here and they evaluated agents. And it seems that we should have got the money that a city manager gets. We collected money, we did this, we went out and everything. So they couldn't pay us that. So they changed our job description and gave us less money. My faith in this is in who you get. And you're right, I'm lost. And maybe I know more than I should. My intel of this is not adapting to what I see. So I would like to be explaining this, and this is my card.
Okay. I almost said, may I approach?
It's not that horrible.
Your attorney too. The last number is who you get a hold of.
Okay, all right, okay. So then, and I'll take any other cards. I point over here at this group. They are a hard group, but they've been fun. But let me do say, if you'll go back one, Meg, if you can. We did the salary ranges for the non-represented groups. And then for the union groups, we kind of did a compensation comparison. And so in other words, and you've got data in front of you. So when I say for the non-represented, you should have something that looks like this in front of you with salary ranges.
When you say salary, does that include benefits?
Oh, there's some slides that we're going to talk about benefits.
Okay, so benefits are not the same.
No, ma'am.
Benefits are not included in the 93%.
No, ma'am.
Okay,
It's just pay.
got it.
Because that number gets to be a whole bunch different when we start to look at total comp. And then when we say the union positions, you should have something that looks like this. Where you see red,
We don't have colors.
you don't have colors?
I have no colors.
Oh,
We'll get you color copies.
Thanks.
well, it's going to look faded gray. So where you see kind of faded gray, those are the areas where we think that you guys might be, the numbers that's been negotiated might be a little bit higher than the market maximums. Okay? One more, Meg. There we go. Oh, before I roll on past the compensation piece, Any questions? Because now I'm going to slow down a little bit more and go into the employee benefits analysis. And I'll back up again and say, on average, the City of Independence base pay is about 93% of the market. So there are some employees who are paid below and some who were paid, no, you didn't have anybody that was paid above the maximum. The cost to implement is typically the cost of those employees who are paid below the minimum of the range. We ran an analysis, but it would have been a snapshot in time. Some of those jobs have changed, departments have moved since we did our work, or completed our work in January. But the dollar amount was about 0.4% of the overall base salary budget. And
Say that again.
Yeah, say that one more time.
Yeah.
it was about 0.4%. This is what I'll do. Is it Delucci?
Yeah, it's Delucci, thanks.
It was about $65,000.
Thank you.
So that, and keep in mind, that was for those folks who are paid below the minimum, and that's typically the cost to implement. So it was not significant. It was a minimal amount compared to the overall salary budget for the city. Okay? So then we'll move on. As it relates to the employee benefits, one of the things that we took a look at was the cost of medical care insurance for both family and single. There's a whole bunch of other spaces in between that you can slice and dice that, employee and spouse, employee and child. So we just did family and single coverage. We also took a look at retirement, long-term care, retiree health care, because for a lot of my municipalities, they like for us to take a look at it and offer an opinion. We looked at retiree benefits, we looked at long-term and short-term disability, and we looked at paid time off. So kind of those typical kinds of benefits that you would see. And again, most often, the most questions we get is around the health insurance piece, and most often the paid time off. So with that, when we take a look at that medical care benefits and for family coverage, one of the things when we were trying to decide, yes, ma'am? Do you have a question? No?
Me?
Yes, okay. When we were trying to decide where was that marketplace, the city, because of the electric company, competes in the private sector. You can compete with consulting firms, you compete a little bit with some of the other private utilities. The Parks and Recreation in particular, the museum aspects, there isn't anything else like it in the Kansas City metropolitan area. So it's a thing of its own. So what we ended up doing is looking at all, and then we took a look at union environments, non-union environments, local governments, and the Midwest. And when we did that, what we found is, and I want you to take your eyes over to where we see the yellow, because that's Independence. When we look at family coverage and just looking at Independence's PPO and the PPO2, you guys pay $1,538 and $1,345. That's what you all pay for family coverage. The employee has the option then of $384 or $295. And when we look, and these data points comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they do it like quarterly. The average in the marketplace, when we look at all of these data points, is about $1,136.30. That means that's what every other employer on average is paying. And then when we look at those data points, every other employer in a non-union environment, they pay about $985.59 for family coverage. And that employee would pay about $483.90. That's right around that middle. And you'll see, even when we go from like the high to the low, as it relates to what does an employee have to pay for his family coverage, it's still lower in the City of Independence. And what then does the city pay? It's still significantly higher than the averages that we see in each of those categories. And I think I also understand, sometimes I have to remember which city am I in, but there's a clinic. Mm-hmm. But you all also have a physician, which is fabulous. And a lot of my municipalities, Topeka, is moving in that direction as well. And that's being very helpful as it relates to costs associated with medical care, medical coverage. Okay. Then when we take a look at single coverage, because for the longest, everybody, the employers just covered single coverage, and it wasn't anything that an employer paid, but we don't see that so much anymore. So again, I'll focus you in the kind of yellow portion, where you see the City of Independence for the PPO1, you guys are paying right around $455. The PPO2, it's $397. And then scooch over, the employees paying about $113 for the PPO1 and about $87 for the PPO2. And then when you look at those averages, you'll still see, and I don't know how you did this, for the individual coverage, the City of Independence is paying less than the averages of each of those different sectors. And I wondered if that was because you kind of have the clinic and are your costs starting to fall. And then the employee is paying from about $97 up to, I think, $133. So you're within that ballpark for the most part. Okay? Yes.
So it looks like Independence, if you're a single coverage, is getting off a little cheaper than a lot of the others.
Uh-huh.
But the family coverage, the city's paying quite a bit more than
Yes.
most of the other employers. Why the difference?
I think, keep an eye on them. I think your plan might be richer than the norm.
For the family?
Go back one, if you will, Meg.
It's richer,
Yes.
richer for the family and not for the individual?
Well, the family coverage piece is the one that typically where there's a huge cost that's associated with it. That is as much as we can have you pay, as much as you can pay, and coax you into a, oh my, health savings account. Oh my, I think I'm talking too much.
Okay, now talk to me a little bit more. Explain that to me.
Can I
Okay,
get
so-
can I get your business card?
Does this not include the HSA?
We do have
Off-
health savings accounts.
You do them?
We do have an HSA option, yes.
Do a lot of the employees participate in it?
No. No, we only have less than 50 employees. I believe Terry Covington's here, but I believe, 50 employees participate in the OA2 plan, the qualified high deductible. It's minimal. Most of our employees have family coverage, and most of our employees are in OAP1.
The same with the single? Is more the single in the regular PPOs rather than an HSA?
That was the overall, as I said.
Oh,
I think there's
overall, okay.
about 50 employees that choose either individual coverage or family coverage. The OAP2 is the qualified high deductible plan.
Okay. I'm on the HSA.
Yeah, then you would be in the OAP2 plan, correct?
Yeah.
Don't go, just in case. Any other questions regarding that piece? There we go. So then the long story short, around the benefits piece, the employees are doing extremely well. And I know they do have access to a benefit statement because one of the employees that's a part of the union pulled his up on his phone so that he could show it to me. Yeah. He was impressed, and so too was I. The piece as it relates to long-term care and retiree health, I kind of felt compelled to add this one because within the last couple of years, one of my clients on the Missouri side had me take another look at the retiree health piece. And we did a special survey. And what we found is that there are a lot of municipalities that offer retiree health. The caveat is they don't pay for it. They sponsor it. The employees then are responsible for paying what those costs might be, and then that was the majority. And then after that, there were a few that would pay just the flat rate, typically $400, and that would be about it. So I'm seeing a lot of the retiree health plans kind of go by the wayside.
Did you compare ours?
to, well, because it was so recent that we've taken a look. I figured out after the fact that you have one.
We'll wait for them. Okay, I get it.
So don't get me in trouble.
All right,
Mr.
all right.
Okay. All right. That you have one, and that I think you do contribute nicely to it. But I'm thinking, though, since now that you've got the clinic and it's staffed with a doctor and not just a nurse, you might be able to do a whole lot of things that's different than hanging on to, you do what you guys need to do as it relates to the demographics of the employees. Keep an eye on them. But I think the clinic is going to be very helpful going forward as it relates to cost. Paid vacation, you guys are really competitive. After the first up to about 5 years are not so much, in that you only offer, I think, about 10 days. But when we get down to that 10 to 15 years, it's a solid 20. And then after 15 years, you guys are at 25. So it's competitive. Sick days, it's competitive at 12. This is the one that threw me off, and it's like, how does the City of Independence get to 12 holidays? And Deborah said, Truman. It's like, that's right, I get it. So you guys have 12 holidays, and typically what we'll see is about 11 or so. So then, in conclusion, your overall comp ratio is about 93%. When we take a look at benefits, the expectation is that the cost of benefits would be like an additional 37.3% of salaries when you kind of do that averaging. And then the other piece is that it is really going to be important for the city to adjust those salary ranges on an annual basis. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to come back and do an in-depth dive like we did. All of my clients will reach out to me on an annual basis and say, what are you recommending as it relates to adjusting the salary ranges? And that's so that they can keep up with the price of labor. And for the last 4 or 5 years, it's been about 1.5% to 2%. And so you really have to make sure that those salary ranges are being adjusted. And after about 3 to 5 years, unless there's a significant shift in the marketplace, that would be about the time that you need to go back in and take a look at the market to make sure that you're still competitive. Keep in mind, not every job, the pay for a job increases. Some of them will decrease, and that's because when my more senior employees leave the workforce, the data then starts to go downward because typically they've been higher paid, and so then it kind of resets itself. Questions? If there aren't any questions, it's really been a pleasure. And after we've gone through the initial conversations with the directors in the union, we've also gone back and showed them where their departments were, where employees are in their departments. And I think it's going to get a little bit, it's going to take a little time for them to get accustomed to. It's not set in stone. Like I said, we have those levels of complexity because we anticipate growth. What would be that next market data? If there is a promotion, what does that look like? So I'll be around for a while helping them work their way through the process. But all in all, the cost to implement, honestly, is minimal with me doing this work for as long as I have, and the number or the dollar amount that it's going to cost you to bring it up. And I think that number would even be lower because there's a department or two that's been restructured.
Okay.
Can I ask a
Yes,
question?
go ahead. Yes.
There's a, thank you, Gail, by the way, for all this information. There's just a tremendous amount of numbers and statistics that go into this, and I haven't had the chance to digest all of it. But there's a lot more here that we need to look at, and I'm sure that the department heads and the city manager and the assistant city managers will be looking at a lot of this and probably coming back to us for some recommendations in changing some of the salary schedules. Is there, in conjunction with this, I know there was something in here I was looking at about performance reviews and doing the review of different employees, and that's something that's done on an individual basis. But I do that in my business on an annual basis, and I think it's extremely important that we look at performance when we're looking at potential salary increases in the future. Would you make a comment on that?
Did you see me almost do that old-fashioned shout when you said that? And I had to hold myself. But absolutely, when it comes to understanding where those compa ratios are, I think before we got to this point, the directors may have been accustomed to saying, I need this job in a particular salary range so that they could give that person an increase. I think we also know that there's been some positions that's been eliminated that didn't get replaced, so we've got employees doing their old job and maybe components of another job that they didn't have before. A performance management system that's tied to the compensation structure with the salary increase matrix really is going to be very important going forward. So that, because in one of my conversations I had today, as it relates to where a job was placed, I asked that particular director, well, what I said was, this is the maximum dollar amount on this salary range. Do you anticipate you're going to pay this employee more than this maximum? And his response was, well, no. So then that's a job then that doesn't need to move. It's where it needs to be. And then there were questions about, well, can we split the difference and then just slide the job in this salary range? And I said, no, the jobs are in the ranges according to the market averages. That's how we determine, so that you don't have to make a decision about, okay, we'll put Jim's job here and Terry's job here without any consistent rhyme and reason. It really is a market analysis. And if you think you've got data, I've got levels of complexity sheets that has the data points for all of the different levels. So we'll know where that next level is for a job. And that was another part of a conversation that I had today with a fabulous director when I said, these are the numbers, so we won't just arbitrarily put a job in a salary range. We'll put it in according to the market numbers, according to the market data. And I think it's better understood. It's going to take some time because it's been 20 years that you've done it the old way, so it's going to take some time. So, and I live in Kansas City, so I'm 27 and a half minutes if the cops don't catch me speeding up. That 35 thing is hard by the cemetery. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Just to follow up, so do you have some resources
Yes.
so that we can develop performance evaluations?
Absolutely.
And maybe do that in conjunction, with the employees? And the reason I ask that is because I think it's important that the employees not only get together, but also get together in a method that they can come up with, the way, and with the supervisor, that their performance can be evaluated fairly and justly. I was talking with a person the other day about some of the history with Japan after World War II, and Edward Deming, you probably heard that name, and I have suggested to the Truman Library that they have a special seminar or night when they have some experts come in, because it changed not only Japan, but then it came back and changed the United States with the quality circles and all those things. I don't know if some of that could be used
Absolutely.
in developing the performance evaluations in city event.
I always say, as the council have given the city administrator those 2 or 3 strategic priorities, those 2 or 3, no more than 5 things that needs to get done over the next year or so, then that has to be pushed down. And I think, and it should be things that benefit the city from a revenue standpoint and a service standpoint. And so then it's easier to have a conversation about giving an increase when we've been conscientious about the budget and we are able to figure out where other dollars are. So absolutely. And Mr. Robertson, when I have lunch with Mr. Van Camp, I'll make sure that he calls you. I think we should all just have lunch and talk through it.
Great.
All right.
Question for you. You've done this for a long time. Just tell me in general, an organization of this size with both represented and non-represented employees, how often should we be reviewing this?
What we say is every 3 to 5 years.
And we haven't done it in 20.
That's the other reason, Mayor. It's going to take a little while for the department directors to get accustomed to the system that we're offering, because it's just been a phone call to say, I think this person should be here, and
So, I mean, my point in saying that, and Mr. City Manager, I mean, what we're trying to establish here with this presentation tonight, and we appreciate it, and it's certainly a lot of data that we don't have, you know, the advantage to sit and kind of discuss at length tonight, that we're trying to create an infrastructure here. I mean, we're trying to, our goal is to have an, I think you put it very well, a competitive and equitable pay scale for our employees. We are one of the largest employees in our community, and we want to be a model employer. That is our objective. We want to be competitive in the marketplace. We want to recruit the best people to work here in the City of Independence. And we need to create a sustainable wage and compensation scale so that we can retain those people throughout their careers if they choose to continue to be here. So I guess what I'm asking or saying is that, you know, this is far too much for us, the four of us to move to draw a conclusion from this evening. I really appreciate the time that's been put into this. So what, moving forward, are our next steps and your next steps as you continue to develop the budget for this year and our 5- and 10-year forecast?
Thank you, Mayor. That's a great question. I believe our next steps are going to be to go back and summarize this information, go ahead and complete our report. And then the reason we brought this to the council this evening is, you know, I know this is of interest, but more importantly, that the council does ultimately have the responsibility for approving the pay plan and any changes therein. So I wanted you to have at least that tertiary understanding of what this is, and know that with the significant funding appropriation that you made for this project, you know, where that stood. Going forward, once the council is able to approve that, and hopefully that happens within the next couple of weeks or thereafter, we're going to begin to implement that in next year's budget. And that immediate first step is really what Ms. Merriweather is addressing tonight, and that is to get those employees who are not presently at the minimum of those new salary ranges up to that. And then over time, we begin to try to move people closer to that market pay, the comp ratio that she's addressed with you tonight. And then to Councilman Robertson's point, to try to start to begin the process of driving organizational change and moving into this model here. But you have to do that in a sustainable way, of course, and one that the organization can come along. As we said, we've operated off that same paradigm for 21 years now. We have to do so in a sustainable way. But we do want to move toward a better model, as the mayor said, for recruitment, retention, and employee morale issues as well, too.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Appreciate it. Okay, our next presentation is regarding the Eastgate Business Park Pre-Development Agreement. Mr. City Manager.
Yes, Madam Mayor, members of the council, as you are well aware, a major priority of this council and certainly your predecessors is begin to develop the Little Blue Valley area. Over the weekend, as I was beginning to prepare for this presentation, I was looking up some of historical articles about the development of the Little Blue Valley, and 5 years ago, our city cut the ribbon on the completion of the Little Blue Parkway, and at that ribbon cutting remarked that, you know, this was really going to open up the valley for the residential, commercial, and industrial development, and really saw that as imminent. And while we're starting to get some traction on the residential, the industrial, and certainly the commercial continue to be a challenge, and as this council has discussed, is probably going to require some active nudging on the part of the city to get that where we want to go. This has been a top priority of the city, certainly as the council met last fall for their strategic planning session and so on. So what we want to do tonight is update you on our efforts to attract industrial development to the Little Blue Valley. We've been working very closely with a developer and a landowner, specifically at the intersection of R.D. Mize and Little Blue Parkway that we're calling the Eastgate Business Park. We have two presenters tonight specifically that we want to have come up here, Tom Lesnick from our Independence Economic Development Council, to really talk about the why behind this, and then David Bushek from Gilmore and Bell, our bond counsel, to talk about the meat and potatoes of what an arrangement between the city and this developer might look like. Also gathered with us tonight are the developer I've mentioned, the landowner. They're available for any questions the council might have tonight. But we're really seeing this as the kickoff of moving into the next phase of this potential development. So with that, I will yield to Tom Lesnick, and then following him, we'll ask David Bushek just to follow immediately thereafter.
Good evening, Mayor Weir and members of the council.
Very hot mic tonight.
The radio voice is coming out right now. It's certainly an exciting evening and kind of a culmination of about about 4 years of work on this project. David Bushek made the comment beforehand that he looked back at his notes, and there was notes from 2014 when we really started focusing on this site. It's certainly been a priority for our board of directors for the last several years. Obviously, we want to see this community grow. We want to see new jobs. We want to see new private capital investment. During that 4-year period, we needed to identify a site, and it needed to be a site that was the most viable site for this purpose, which is primarily light industrial development with some other ancillary uses such as small office spaces, even a little bit of retail in the future. We identified a 90-acre site, as Mr. Walker mentioned, at the intersection of R.D. Mize and Little Blue Parkway. The EDC, along with the property owner, funded a preliminary design plan for the site to understand what the potential was, how much could be built on the site, how it potentially could be laid out. And then we spent a lot of time vetting developers, looking at developers who have an interest in investing in the property, investing in speculative industrial space, which is as the nature of the word is space that is risky because there's not an identified user for that space. And so tonight is really the culmination of that 4 years of work as you consider kind of the development agreement that Mr. Bushek will go into more detail on. So the development agreement before you calls for a speculative industrial building of about 100,000 square foot. That means a user has not been identified for this particular project. But with it said, I believe there's a risk that we can justify just by looking at some of the past couple of years and what it's told us about industrial space, not only in Independence, but in the Kansas City Metro. Last year in 2017, a total of 7.7 million square foot of industrial space was absorbed. That means it was space that was either empty or was not existing, but was absorbed into the market. The interesting, and that seems like a lot of square footage, and it is. An interesting number about that 7.7 is 4.2 million of that space was speculative space. And the other interesting thing is that speculative space of 4.2 million, almost all of it was filled before it was completed. That is how strong demand is for industrial space in this market right now. In Independence currently, the vacancy rate for industrial space is less than 4%. So we have literally nothing to market to projects looking at the Kansas City Metro and specifically in Independence. Most of the space that is available right now is over 60 years of age. It's highly inefficient space. It is space that is not for 21st century manufacturing. So the opportunities that are before us are extremely limited. And we look back at the history of projects. If we had 100,000 square foot space here in the last year, during 2017, we had 9 projects that came to us that we had potential for attracting to Independence that we could not put a building in front of. So far this year, we have 3 projects that have come to us that need, in that 100,000 square foot range, that we cannot put a building in front of, which means we're out of the running. We will not be able to attract any of those projects. Now, I won't say we win every one of those projects, but in economic development, you want to have your best opportunity to compete. And right now, we do not really have that opportunity. We also have 3 projects that are existing businesses in our community right now today who can move into space that's 100,000 square foot. Some of them don't need a full 100,000 square foot, but the building's being designed to be flexible. It can be multi-tenant. So we have the risk of losing existing employers because, again, we do not have industrial space that's adequate here in our community. Certainly speculative industrial space has been very prevalent on the Kansas side. That's where a lot of that 4 million square foot of space has been built in the past couple of years. And again, those spaces filled up very quickly. In fact, most of them before they were even done. But the shift is starting to take place where projects are starting to look at Missouri. Missouri's not really been much of an area for speculative industrial space. The Kansas space, they're not dealing with a building issue. They're dealing with a workforce issue now, and that's a lack of workforce. And that's something we still have better availability at is workforce right now. It's tight, but we do have workforce more so than what Kansas does because of the Amazon project and Kubota and numerous big projects who have really sapped the labor force in Johnson County, Kansas. I'll also share with you a study that was completed by the real estate firm of Newmark Grubb Zimmer in 2016. It showed that since 2005, every industrial space built in eastern Jackson County is completely occupied. We haven't had a lot of speculative space, but the space that has been built has been filled. So the demand for new, current, modern space is certainly high. And the window of opportunity, I think, is going to be open only so long. Other communities around us, our competing communities of Blue Springs and Lee Summit and Grandview, are all talking about the same thing we're talking about tonight. So, we want to stay ahead of them. We want to be first to market if we can. And then finally, I want to speak about the return on investment on this project, because it is a public-private partnership, as you'll see in the development agreement. Typically, a 100,000 square foot building will employ one person per 1,000 square foot, which means we have the potential for 100 new jobs. In Independence, the average wage for industrial manufacturing jobs is $48,000 per person. As in the Independence for All plan, one of our goals is to get our median household income to $50,000. It's jobs like this that will help us get us there. Manufacturing is actually one of the highest paying sectors in our community, behind healthcare and financial services. So, great opportunity there. The other thing I should point out is that 100 jobs at $48,000, it's $4.8 million from one building that's rolling back into our community in various ways, whether it be through retail sales, just general economic activity. Those dollars will create new dollars coming into the community. And then finally, the other is utility usage. 100,000 square foot building is a big utility user, and we've all talked about and heard from IP&L the need to increase the number of industrial users in our community if we're going to stabilize industrial rates and make them competitive with our area around us. We need not only one 100,000 square foot building, we need 10 100,000 square foot buildings to kind of get there. And the park as an overall development probably has about 800,000 square foot of capacity, total space, industrial space when fully built out. I'll close with the acknowledgement that the development agreement before you is aggressive, but it requires that aggressiveness to get this project kicked off. This is the first phase of the project. There's risk there for everyone involved. We're trying to mitigate the risk for everyone and make this a partnership project. And again, as I mentioned, this could result not only in just this initial first phase of 100,000 square foot, but 800,000 square foot. And all of a sudden now we've got 800 jobs in this 190-acre site in the Little Blue Valley. Our goal is we want to bring in more private capital investment. We want to create more jobs for the residents of our community. And doing all those things, we will achieve what are stated goals in the Independence for All plan that you put together and that we're helping execute. I'll be glad to answer questions. As Mr. Walker mentioned, the developer and the property owner are here, but I'll turn it over to David Bushek. He'll get into more details about the development agreement.
Thank you, Tom.
Tom, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Real simple. If we've got businesses that are thinking we have to move because there's no space available, why don't they build a space?
They don't want to wait.
Number one, they do not want to wait. 90% of the projects that we see, including existing businesses, want to move into an existing building. Speed to market is so crucial right now. Plus also, existing businesses, if they've never done a development of a building, it's a scary thing to do. If you've never built a 100,000 square foot industrial space, it's hard. And they may not want to own it. They may want to be in a lease situation, which in most of our industrial spaces, they're not owned by the end user, they are leased to the end user.
So generally speaking, when you talk about other development within Greater Kansas City and how they've developed things, with the industrial space, don't they also get economic incentives from the cities? I mean, is our only cost really going to be this partnership?
Yeah, incentives are very common. I don't know how we turn that down a little bit.
I think that was me then.
Either way, incentives are very common, and there's incentives built into this development agreement as well. It's part of it. It's what makes it work and make it viable for the developer and possible.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm David Bushek with the law firm of Gilmore & Bell. I will provide a summary of the agreement for you this evening. I'm going to start at kind of a high-level discussion to talk with you about what it means for this to be a pre-development agreement as opposed to a development agreement, and then I will go into some of the specifics in the agreement. As you've heard, we started discussing this project in concept about 4 years ago. At that point, we were just discussing things at a high level. We were discussing the concepts. We started discussing what sort of incentives the city could provide, what sort of ownership structures could apply. Should the city be an owner of this? Should the city be a part owner? Should the city create some other sort of entity to be an owner? So we were talking at a high level. Over the years, occasionally the city team would come to me and ask questions. We'd answer those questions as options were being evaluated. Then fast forward to December of last year, January of this year, the city team had identified a potential developer, potential site, and a potential incentive package. And so my role then was to step back in and try to put some structure to this so everything could move forward. So in talking with the city team, they asked me, given the parameters of what they have negotiated, which I'll talk about in a moment, what form should this take going forward? And I said, I think you really have two options at this point. One would be to use a term sheet, and the second might be a pre-development agreement. A term sheet is just what it sounds like. It's a sheet that typically comes before certain contracts that we might negotiate that has the essential elements of the contract. So not all of the boilerplate, not all of the contract details, but just the high level, what the primary terms are. Or you could use a pre-development agreement, which is a tool that has been used from time to time in some of the projects that I've worked on. And I suppose the way to characterize a pre-development agreement might be it's a slightly more formalized term sheet. It's a document that both parties sign that essentially signals what they'll do going forward, but it's not really to the binding level of a contract that you typically see. So when we present to you, say, a contract for a tax increment financing project, or a cooperative agreement for a community improvement district, or a development agreement, those would have the binding terms that the city would have to follow through on. Developer will build X and the city will provide X dollars, for example. We're not to that stage yet. This pre-development agreement essentially signals what the city will consider in the future and what the developer will do, and then when things finally firm up, how we'll implement. So just to highlight a few of those points in the agreement, some of the language from the agreement, the recitals speak to the city desiring to consider certain incentives moving forward. The parties anticipate a course of action. They're going to evaluate further preparation of a more definitive performance agreement that will come at a later date. Section 1 of the agreement indicates that the phase 1, which I'll talk about in a moment, is conceptual at this time. The parties are engaged in discussions to move forward. If they can agree upon a mutually acceptable phase 1 project, then we'll have a more definitive performance agreement at a later date, and that will contain more of the binding terms. Section 2 of the agreement talks about how Exhibit B has a tentative budget, which is attached. The budget may be refined as more information is collected. And also, the parties will evaluate a plan of financing. Section 3 speaks to future legislative action that the City Council will take to implement if everything comes together. And then finally, some of the terms of the city contributions, which again I'll talk about in more detail in a moment, speaks to the city considering approving these funding sources and making future legislative decisions, waiving certain fees and so forth. So the point I want to emphasize at a high level is this doesn't contain the binding terms for you to move forward. It's essentially a roadmap of what the city will consider if the developer comes through with their part of the deal. So to walk through some of the specifics again, some of the specifics of the agreement, the scope of the project is set forth in Exhibit B. The overall budget for the project, considering all of the hard costs and soft costs, is approximately 6.86, rounded, 6.86 million. And the city will provide certain costs, which I'll discuss in a moment. But that total budget is the estimate based on engineering plans and evaluations that Mr. Lesnick mentioned earlier, of total cost to construct the building, to do the site work, to build the initial infrastructure, all of the soft costs, all the permit fees, etc. Section 2 of the agreement then indicates that the parties will, using this tentative budget, develop a plan of financing. Developers indicate at this point that their private financing will be bank loans. They have not provided an extensive amount of detail, but that is something that will be developed going forward. So we'll have more detailed sources and uses to specify exactly how the developer will bring their funds to the table. Section 3 indicates the conditions that would trigger the city contribution, and there's essentially 3 conditions. The first is that the developer will need to have demonstrated that to the city's satisfaction that they've secured the private financing for the private components of the project. Second, Developer will need to have demonstrated to the city's satisfaction that they have a written binding commitment for that private financing, and they have an executed construction contract for the private portions of the project. And then third, the parties, city and developer, have coordinated for the construction of the project, meaning when the developer builds the private portions, the city's ready to move forward with the road and the public portions, so we need to be coordinated. In exchange for the project then, there's essentially three primary components of the city contribution. So this is the result of the extensive discussions that have occurred over the years, and this is the three primary components of what the city would contribute in terms of incentives and in terms of funding for the project. The first is tax abatement. The agreement indicates that the city will consider Chapter 100 tax abatement for the project. Chapter 100 is a reference to Chapter 100 of the Missouri statutes, which is a mechanism to provide tax abatement. The one time in recent memory that the city has used Chapter 100 was for the Unilever project. That was a very large project. This would be much smaller in scope, but that's the one example of a Chapter 100 project that the city has approved in the past. Chapter 100 tax abatement is a tool that has been extensively used in Missouri. There are other cities on this side of the state that have used Chapter 100 more extensively. Has not happened as much in Independence. The terms of the tax abatement, as the agreement spells out, would be 85% tax abatement for 20 years. When we move forward with the tax abatement package, there would be a cost-benefit analysis that would be presented to you to spell out exactly what the numbers are associated with that tax abatement, what the impact is to the taxing districts, and what the benefit is to the developer. That has not been developed yet, but that's one of the next steps that would occur if we move forward. The second component of the city contribution would be that the city would consider funding for three components of the budget. That is the primary access road that would drive into the site. In the budget, that is estimated to be a cost of around $840,000. Landscaping associated with that improvement at about $100,000, and then the environmental costs associated with the project at about environmental study and review costs at about $25,000. This agreement provides that the maximum contribution that the city would provide is the total of those three amounts together. So again, I'm rounding 964, about $965,000 would be the maximum city contribution, meaning if there are cost overruns associated with any of those components, they would be funded by the developer, but the more formalized agreement would indicate the city would fund those three things in that maximum amount. Then the final component of the city's contribution would be a waiver of the various fees that would be associated with the project. So permit fees, erosion control permit fees, building permit fees, water and sewer tap fees, the license surcharge, those would be waived by future legislative action if the package moves forward. There's a few boilerplate type provisions in the agreement, and then finally the termination provision provides that this agreement, if you approve it, would terminate in one of two ways. First, it would terminate after 6 months if we haven't reached a successful conclusion, or if we do have a more formalized performance agreement, that document would provide that this terminates and we roll over into that agreement, and that agreement would control. With regard to the 6-month deadline, this agreement provides that the City Council can extend it by action. Wouldn't need formal action, probably a motion if we reach that point, but if we're, say, 5 months out and we haven't finished our negotiations on how this would move forward, you could take action to extend that deadline if you saw fit at that point. So back when I came back into the discussions with the city team and I was preparing for a meeting that we held here in January, I knew some of the high-level components, some of the items that I just described for you, and I came to that meeting with some questions that I had jotted down. I was looking back at my notes and I thought it may be helpful for me to walk through these questions, which we now have answers to, because these might be questions that you have too. So when I came to that meeting back in January, these were some of the questions that I needed to make sure we had taken care of to move forward. What happens if there are cost overruns? I've explained to you that we've incorporated a maximum contribution for the city. So if there are cost overruns under this proposal, the developer will cover those costs. Has the real estate transaction been negotiated? The private parties have indicated the answer is yes, and the budget includes an amount for the purchase of land by the developer. What if the tenants who would occupy this building require separate incentives? And the answer to that question is that would be evaluated at a future date by the City Council. We specifically did not include any provisions in this agreement to account for that because we don't know what they are, and it could be that there are no additional incentives requested. So we decided to set that issue aside, and that's not something that's specifically addressed in this agreement. Questions that I had regarding the sources and uses and the funding package. I've explained to you how we've addressed that. We have Exhibit B, which describes the full budget, what we anticipate the developer will fund, and what we anticipate the maximum city contribution would be. Is the developer acting as the developer for the entire project or just this one structure? This agreement just covers phase one. So this only covers one 100,000 square foot building. If this developer develops future buildings or future phases, that's fine, but this agreement does not cover that. Does the developer understand that the Chapter 100 is only for tax abatement and does not provide a unique source of funding? I think the answer to that question is yes. As a result of our discussions, the Chapter 100 transaction only provides tax abatement, is not an additional separate source of funding. So private funding would be required by the developer. They would essentially need to come to the table with their own private financing to make the project go forward. And the Chapter 100 transaction is only for the purpose of tax abatement. And then there was one final question, which this was a point of extensive discussion amongst the city team. And the question is essentially, what level of assurance does the city need in order to move forward with this package? How do we make sure that the building is occupied and there will actually be tenants? The original draft of the agreement that we provided to the developer team, we included a provision which said, developer would need to present proof, for the city to move forward, developer would need to present proof that they have at least 75,000 square feet of the 100,000 square feet of the building filled. And that would be either by signed letters of intent or by signed leases. The developer responded to that provision as we expected. The response was that would be great for all the parties involved. However, that would require additional architect, contractor work. It would need to get to, the project would need to get to a point where they have designs and renderings that they could then take to potential tenants to market the site, and that typically doesn't happen until later. So the developer's response was essentially, if that becomes the plan for the city to move forward with the incentive package that I've summarized, that's a cost that the city would need to bear. And I will say, from my experience on other similar projects, their response is not unexpected on this point. And Tom just spoke to you about the risks associated with moving forward with a speculative industrial project. He's indicated that there is extensive demand today. Developer, they have indicated, and this is always the case with these sort of projects, when they go seek their private loan, their lender is going to be just as concerned about that issue, maybe even more so than the city. So all indications are that that issue should be able to take care of itself. However, I wanted to point out that we had extensive discussions on this point, and what's finally included in the agreement are the items that I summarized for you earlier. Those three things that the developer will need to prove up. They have financing, they have a written financing commitment, they have a signed construction contract, but not so far as having signed letters of intent or signed leases, and that's the element of risk that Tom just spoke with you about. That concludes all of all the questions that I had coming into the project again, and my summary of the agreement, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Okay, thank you very much, Dave. Before we go to questions, Mr. City Manager, I just want to kind of frame this discussion.
Please.
And what it, as Dave has articulated to us, we're certainly not here to vote on any projects, but what is the action that you, if any, that you're seeking from the council tonight?
First and foremost, I wanted to, this is, as Dave has said, and we've all mentioned, this is, and you're all well aware, this is a project we've talked about ad nauseum, the desire to get this going. So I wanted the council to be aware of the progression that we've had on this project to date. Also wanted to make sure the council was comfortable that as we would begin to finalize any last remaining details of this pre-development agreement, and as Dave has articulated, this is just the precursor to next steps and not binding on the council, but that if we put this on the agenda, you know, I knew this would merit a more in-depth presentation, so I wanted to make sure that the council would be okay with us moving towards getting this before you for legislative action.
So, are you seeking some consensus from the council just to give you direction if, you know, once we have some time for some questions, just to give you the authority to move forward with next steps
Right.
to continue to flesh out all of these details which have been laid out before us this evening?
Very, very simply, just want to go ahead and finalize last details and then get this on the council agenda for legislative details if there were no major substantive changes or concerns that the council had with that. But I thought getting this presentation tonight would allow for any of those potential concerns to be addressed.
Very good. Okay. Comments and questions?
I don't have the document you've referenced throughout the night. Can I get a copy of it?
We'll get a copy printed for all the council members and delivered to you tomorrow morning.
Okay,
including
so
the exhibits that David mentioned as well.
I would really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
I would have liked to have read it before you presented, so Mr. Bushek, I will be calling you, I know, after I review the document.
That sounds fine.
But from what I gathered from your 20 minutes here tonight, the city obligation is $965,000 in improvements to the property.
Public infrastructure, yes.
Public infrastructure. Waiver of fees, that's not included in the 965, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
There are costs in the budget that you will see. There's an estimate of those costs, and the city would essentially be waiving certain of those costs.
But that's not included in the 965.
Correct.
The cost for the city to maintain safety services for this industrial park. I'm looking at fire, I'm looking at police, and I know those costs can't be included in the 965.
That's correct.
Correct? Okay. Is the cost of the bonds included in the 965?
No, the 965 just covers the three items that I mentioned, the road, landscaping, and then environmental costs.
So what is the total cost to the city? Do we know?
I think what, Dave, correct me if I'm wrong here, but when you reference that cost-benefit analysis, that one of the things that this pre-development agreement would trigger would be us then going and costing out specifically to this property the cost of the Chapter 100 abatement versus the benefit that would be derived by all the taxing jurisdictions, and then the a more definitive estimate on those fee waivers that we've discussed.
Yes, the cost-benefit analysis that is the companion to the Chapter 100 is essentially the tax analysis, and as we're considering the performance agreement, so the more definitive document that I mentioned, I think we'll have a better estimate of those costs. As I mentioned, the budget is preliminary at this point. One of the things that I will make sure that we address in more detail in the performance agreement is what those costs specifically are that the city might waive if you decide to do that, and kind of a preview of what the negotiations with the developer might be. We may cap those also.
And we'd have to rezone the property. I don't think it's zoned industrial at this point. Are we looking at rezoning just this one site, or are we talking about a larger section?
I think it's already zoned.
I don't think it's zoned industrial. Maybe I'm wrong.
Tom Lesnick.
It's not?
It's not, it's
You know,
commercial.
Yeah,
Is it
we would need to
commercial?
do a city, we would need to
It's
do a
commercial.
rezoning
A little bit
approval
of
by the
it's commercial.
council.
I'm looking at Randy Pratt.
Property owner's here, he can speak to that.
Hey, Randy, is it zoned industrial?
No.
It is not.
I didn't think so.
A small portion on the northern tip is zoned office, and then there's some, I think it's C2 zoning, I'm not sure, but one commercial designation. It was part of the Bell Development Group many years ago that rezoned a portion of the property. It's primarily residential zoning, but a small portion to the north. The designation for zoning in the future, as I understand it, would be for a business park, not zoned industrial, and there are key differences.
Oh, okay.
So there's a lot more control in terms of the visual appearance, the uses that are there for a business park, which permits office uses, as well as some limited retail, very small, but it's primarily better looking, higher tech buildings
Right,
that fall under
right.
that designation.
Okay, thank you.
And Councilwoman DeLucy, please, and the rest of the council, please keep in mind that on the April 2nd council meeting, we'll be presenting the new comprehensive development plan for final approval, which does include some new, as Mr. Pratt was stating, some new classifications that specify the type of outcome that we'd like to see there. So wouldn't necessarily be utilizing today's current comp plan standards and zoning classifications, but what was going to be coming forward in the new comp plan.
Okay. And can you tell me who was on the city team and who was on the development team? You keep talking like I should know this, and I don't, David. I'm sorry.
City team, city staff members that I work with, city manager, assistant city manager, finance director, the mayor, Tom, on behalf of the EDC.
Okay.
Maybe forgetting somebody, Dale at times, right?
Okay.
I think that summarizes it.
Okay. And final question. Is there a penalty for the developer if everything falls through on his end after we've performed?
Under this agreement, there are no penalties. As I mentioned, it has a termination provision. So after that 6-month period, if we haven't reached a final agreement, this agreement would terminate. Nobody would be paying anything, no penalties to anybody. Penalties for non-performance are the type of things that would be addressed in the next performance agreement. So when we bring a more definitive agreement, it's the entire package, including the Chapter 100 transaction, that's when we would address those issues.
I would just be concerned that we have performed as the city and nothing happens.
Well, and that's one of the last issue that I mentioned, and the point that we've discussed extensively. What level of assurance does the city want, does the city need in order to provide its incentive in exchange for what they're going to build? And as I mentioned on that spectrum of we know we have tenants versus we think we have tenants versus something farther down the scale, we're not all the way to knowing that we have tenants. We'll move forward with when they have a financing package and when they have a construction contract, and then presumably they'd be able to fill the building. But that's where this pre-development agreement takes us.
Okay. Thank you.
Anything else? Yes, Councilman?
Thank you for the presentations, both of you. It occurs to me that there's really more opportunity cost if we don't do it. We have talked for a long time about bringing new jobs, new industry to Independence, and it takes some risk, and this is requiring some of the city to take some of the risk. And so the risk for us is to do a public-private partnership like this with the developer and allow the speculative building to be built first and start the ball rolling. And that's what we've talked about in our strategic planning. We've talked about trying to get more industrial jobs in Independence and develop industrial space. And I think this is what we have to do. If we're ever going to have it in Independence, we have to start someplace, and this looks like a great place to start. I'm in favor of us doing this. I'm not sure where we're going to come up with the money.
That was my question.
But that's something that we'll have to struggle with, and that's our problem. But I think that part of the risk is, and you said, the road and the development of the building's all going to be going on simultaneously. It's not like we're putting in a road to nowhere. So it's all going to be happening at the same time. It's just that the road is speculative, just like the building is, until we have tenants in it. And the opportunity cost for us not doing it is more expensive than $1 million. It's probably, if we don't do it this year or next year, it's probably going to be 5 times that in 5 years, or 10 times that in 10 years. So we've got to start now.
Thank you. Again, I just want to say we say, 2014, but certainly I think the desire for this goes further back than that. I would say all the way back to the construction of the Little Blue Parkway, that the intent of building and spending all those decades and all those dollars building Little Blue Parkway was to give us these opportunities. Incidentally, this is the same site that we submitted for the Amazon H2 headquarters, which was included in the Kansas City Regional proposal to Amazon. So the site itself has a tremendous amount of merit in terms of its access already to certain assets in our community, its proximity to I-70, to rail, to utilities, to the Little Blue Parkway, of course, the Little Blue Trace. So there's a lot of merit surrounding this site. It's nearby to some of our other successful development that has happened in retail and commercial. So I just wanted to, speak to sort of the merits of the site and why we have pursued this site where other sites that we have pursued have not brought us this far, including the 7 and 78 highway site, which is still a great opportunity for us, but we have not been able to move that site forward as far as we have to this point. There's a lot left to figure out on this project. We're certainly not here to make any decision on what, how the public portion of this would be financed, but I do think it's important that we take this step to continue the discussion, understanding that these are the things that the city is willing to consider moving forward, so that we can further our discussions with the developer and the landowner. So there's certainly much more discussion, much more investigation, much more public comment to come, but unless there's some objection from the council, I would give the city manager the authority to move forward in next steps to move this project forward. Yes.
I too am in favor of this project, but like all projects, I'm sure that they were in favor of every action has an opposite and equal reaction. I would caution that we move slowly as we have in the past, and I've commended you before in doing this, even when people wanted to rush it through, to dot all our I's and cross all our T's. I know it's not the same thing, but we've entered into things before saying, before we got here, and we're paying for it every year, saying that we need this at any cost. Forget where we get the money. This is something we have to do. Well, we can't afford that. So am I hearing that we're going to finalize this in 2 weeks?
No, what we need to do as staff is go back and put the final touches on this pre-development, and we're there, we're close. We would then put that before the council for your consideration. But what that would be indicating, if approved by the council, is giving the developer some assurance, that as they move forward to secure their financing, as you've heard, that was their primary funding mechanism is private financing, would let them know that the city would be favorable to those particular terms and conditions. And then once that transaction would be completed, we'd come back for this more binding final development agreement. But there, as you say, Councilmember, we always want to be methodical and thoughtful without, unnecessarily dragging our feet, but also making sure we consider things like the councilman's brought up, funding sources, and that we bring up, all the terms and conditions that we get the output and the product that we're seeking here.
I don't want this to be, my favorite saying from one of your assistant city managers, paralysis through analysis. I mean, I want to move forward, but I want to move at a pace that gives us, as Councilman DeLucci said, hadn't talked to me. I mean, what we've talked about is how much this is. And we got on board because we heard that amount. Well, we're hearing other amounts now. So I know that we're going to have the conversation, but, let's have it in depth.
Okay.
And I really want to see the agreement. I don't want to see the agreement the Friday before the Monday we have to
I
take
apologize
a
it
look.
wasn't in your packet tonight, and we'll have it in your mailboxes tomorrow morning.
Thank you so much.
I would, I guess, maybe say that this is a project that we've referred to as Project W for a number of years. That's been presented. We present this at every meeting of the Economic Development Corporation, the Management Committee, the quarterly board meetings. So that, you know, that's a term that we have used for this project over the years is, and I know that's one that has been spoken about. We are, and as I say, this is the closest that we've come to bringing something before the council in this pursuit to increase our industrial and office development in Independence. Mr. City Manager, are you anticipating, I mean, I appreciate you all being here tonight, this evening to give this presentation. We certainly, as Councilmember Lucy said, don't want this appearing on the council agenda and trying to have this discussion on a night when we're supposed to be taking formal action on it. So I think this is a great opportunity to understand what further information council would need in order to give this consideration sometime in the future, but I think it's a great next step. So, anything else? Okay, thank you very much for being here.
Talk to you soon, David.
Sounds good.
Councilwoman, to the greatest extent possible, if we could, Dave is a bright legal mind and is compensated as such, so if we could package those questions and send back to the full council as well, so that Dave doesn't end up with 7 phone calls and 7 different bills from the attorney.
Yeah, I would just, you know, ask the council if there's questions. I know we had some questions about the previous presentation as well on the compensation. You know, if we could direct those through the city manager, he's working closely with these consultants and with our legal team and our economic development partners. So let's make sure that we're coordinating those through the city manager. Our next staff report, or our only staff report, is regulation of short-term rentals. Mr. City Manager.
Yes, Madam Mayor, members of the council. Finally, this evening we have a presentation from Assistant Director of Community Development, Charlie DeSalle. Independence, of course, enjoys a great tourism industry, but with that comes a lot of visitors to our community. We want to make sure they have a safe, consistent experience. So as the rise in popularity in renting one's private home out has become more of a trend, we want to make sure we're prepared to handle that. So Mr. DeSalle has a presentation for the council, and we would be seeking some direction about which way the council wants to go following that presentation. So I will yield to you, Mr. DeSalle.
Thank you. Mayor and members of the council, as you are aware, many municipalities around the country and the region have begun looking into ways to regulate the rapidly growing industry of short-term rentals. Companies such as Airbnb, VRBO, and others are transforming the travel industry by allowing citizens the ability to rent out their homes to travelers with the ease of a website. These travel options join the list of other community sharing initiatives such as Uber. Municipalities are trying to find the best ways to handle these rentals, as they are generally unregulated because municipal codes and ordinances have never envisioned this type of use and have yet been developed to regulate them. In 2017, at the request of the Hotel Motel Alliance, city management asked staff to begin looking at this issue after complaints from citizens started to trickle in, and it became clear that our current codes have not yet been adapted to this type of use. A staff working group including Fire, Parks, Rec, and Tourism, Community Development, and other departments, as well as the City Manager's Office, has met, and the following presentation is a summary of their findings. First, why does the city have an interest in regulating this use? The main complaints the city are receiving deal with issues of neighborhood compatibility. Common issues expressed in those complaints include loss of off-street parking, excessive noise, and property maintenance issues such as trash related to short-term rental uses. Other complaints deal with the location of the use, the number of uses taking place in a specific neighborhood or area, the amount of people and rooms being rented out in a particular use, and neighbors not knowing who to contact when issues arise, leading them to contact the police department. Other important issues the staff working group noted included safety concerns. Do these units meet all fire code regulations? Have they been inspected for life safety concerns? Does the actual property owner of these units carry liability insurance in the case of an accident on their property? As council is aware, the city has a transient guest tax, and as these uses go unregulated, the city is not collecting the use tax from overnight stays on these uses. Members of the staff working group have met with members of the Hotel Motel Alliance, including members of bed and breakfast operations, and the main theme to come away from that meeting was these operators would like to see a level playing field for all types of uses. So while the last few slides have discussed some of the issues the city has had with short-term rentals, there are positives that these uses can bring to our city. Currently, our tourism division does not promote these properties because they are not regulated and not consistently paying into the transient guest tax. But arguably, they could add to our supply of properties, enhance the tourism experience in areas that are underserved by hotels. It's obvious that there is a market demand for short-term rentals, that demand is increasing, and with that, the supply is on the rise. Short-term rentals not only provide an affordable option for tourists, but they also provide a convenient alternative when, in some cases, they can be located in the heart of historic areas and other tourist destinations. Lastly, short-term rentals can create a convenient mechanism for property owners to generate supplemental income and can assist in raising median household income for our residents. So let's go over some of our current regulations that the city can apply to this use. First, looking at our zoning codes. It's imperative to note that the city does not have a definition for short-term rentals. As such, the closest definition that can be applied is a bed and breakfast. That definition states that a bed and breakfast is an owner or manager occupied detached house that contains 6 or fewer guest rooms for short-term lodging and in which the only meal provided to guests is breakfast. For the purposes of that term, a guest is a person who rents a room in a bed and breakfast establishment for no more than 30 consecutive days. So a few things to point out in that definition. First, an owner or manager must occupy the residence that is being used. Simply put, with short-term rentals, that's not always the case. In some cases, an owner of a property may choose to rent their house for a weekend that they know they will not be in town, and in others, an owner may choose to rent out a room in their house that is not occupied, but that owner continues to occupy the house. Second, if there are more than 6 rooms being rented, it's considered a hotel and isn't subject to other regulations. And then lastly, if any one person rents a room for more than 30 consecutive days, the unit is considered a rental unit and is subject to other regulations, one of which would include a rental-ready inspection. Bed and breakfasts are allowed in all residential districts within the City of Independence by a special use permit. Special use permits cost a minimum of $500 and take between 2 to 3 months to get approved. During the approval process, a public hearing is held by the Planning Commission in which all owners within 185 feet are notified by mail, and the City Council has final review authority. Looking at what's required in way of business licensing through our Regulated Industries Division, short-term rentals are conducted for profit. These uses do require a business license. As mentioned previously, if any one person rents a short-term rental for more than 30 days, the unit's considered a rental unit, and in that case would be subject to a rental license rather than a business license, and again, would be subject to a rental-ready inspection. In some cases, these uses could be required to be permitted as a lodging establishment. This would be required if the use included 5 or more rooms. Furthermore, if a use included 7 or more rooms, it would be required to get a permit for the kitchen. The city's fire department does annual inspections on all licensed businesses within the city. As these uses require a business license, they would be subject to an annual inspection. In these inspections, the fire department is looking to make sure that there are fire extinguishers, proper electrical panels, proper extension cord use, proper egress, and proper addressing of the units. One of the bigger points on this slide would be that if a short-term rental is rented out to 6 or more people at any one time, it's considered to be a boarding house, and a boarding house is required to have a full sprinkler system to pass fire inspection.
So it's a bed and breakfast though, Charlie?
Mm-hmm.
A bed and breakfast needs to have a sprinkler system too.
If it's 6 or more rooms, yes.
No, not if it's 6 or more.
Well, that's my understanding on that.
Okay.
I guess I'm not 100%
All right.
sure, but. Okay, lastly, let's take a look at how the recently amended hotel motel ordinance would apply to short-term rentals. In that ordinance, a hotel is defined as any structure or any portion of any structure that is occupied or intended or designed for occupancy by transients for dwelling, lodging, or sleeping purposes. As such, short-term rentals would meet that definition and would be subject to all regulations of Chapter 5, Article 3, including the transient guest tax, guest registration requirements, and rental frequency requirements. So just a quick summary on all those regulations. Based off the application of any current regulations we would have in a residential zoning district, a special use permit is required, which costs a minimum of $500 and takes 2 to 3 months to get approved. There would be a business license that is required. That's a cost of $50. The 6.5% transient guest tax, and then pointing out that if the use rents to more than 5 people, it's considered a boarding house. And lastly, if there are 4 or more rooms associated with the use, it shall be permitted as a lodging establishment. So after the staff working group went through our current regulations, a discussion ensued regarding potential issues that face the city in regards to short-term rentals. Some of the issues discussed included the effects of our current regulations and effects that our current regulations and fees may have on the use and are achieving compliance on the use. For example, if a citizen wants to offer the top floor of their home for rent for a few times per year, does the $500 special use permit deter that citizen from doing so, or does the citizen just go ahead and list their property and hope they don't get caught? Additionally, the staff working group discussed how if the citizen were to choose the latter, hoping that they don't get caught, enforcing on these uses can be extremely difficult, if not impossible, for staff. Most short-term rental sites do not disclose the address until after reservations are confirmed, making the ability to find these locations pretty difficult. Some listings only provide interior pictures of the units, making the ability for our staff to find these locations nearly impossible. The staff working group did note that inquiries into the city about the uses are increasing. As such, it's fair to say that the number of listings on short-term rental websites most likely is also going to increase. As I had mentioned earlier, the staff working group did meet with the Hotel Motel Alliance, more specifically the bed and breakfast owners in that group, and they stressed for the city to create a level playing field. Lastly, the staff working group noted that these uses continue to increase and the complaints on these uses are increasing as well. Another factor to consider is the number of websites that are offering these services. We currently estimate that Independence has approximately 25 rentals listed on several short-term rental websites. The graphic on the screen above represents a current snapshot of the short-term rental industry. Again, as this industry continues to grow, it's safe to say that there may currently be more than this, and there will likely be more in the future. The slide I have here on the screen above represents a listing currently available on Airbnb. As you can see, the only thing we know for sure is that it is Independence. The listing gives you a good example of how our enforcement staff has no idea of the exact location of the listing, and as there are no pictures of the exterior, enforcement becomes very difficult. So looking at what some of our nearby cities are doing, earlier this month, our neighboring community of Lee Summit passed a short-term rental ordinance. Some of the highlights of that ordinance include limiting short-term rentals to single and two-family dwellings, requiring an owner or representative to occupy a dwelling unit on the same or adjacent parcel. You can only rent a maximum of 2 rooms. You can have either 4 unrelated guests or 1 single family renting at any one time. They do require a business license and all taxes to be paid. And lastly, all units must be provided with a fire extinguisher, smoke and CO2 detectors, child-proof outlets, and a map identifying escape routes. Last month, the City Council for Kansas City also adopted a short-term rental ordinance. Highlights of that ordinance include limiting stay duration to 30 days, having no more than 2 people to a bedroom, and limiting units to 8 total guests. Units cannot be used for receptions, parties, meetings, or other similar events. It disallows food service and disallows exterior advertising of the units, such as signage. Looking at what Jefferson City has done, at the beginning of this year, the City Council of Jefferson City adopted an ordinance to make short-term rentals legal in the city. Previously, their zoning code prohibited residential property owners from renting out rooms. Their ordinance limits the duration of rental to 1 month. It does require a special use permit in residential districts, which is reviewed by their commission and their council and costs $210, and it also requires business licensing and lodging tax. Springfield, Missouri is actually reviewing an ordinance at their meeting tonight. Their proposed ordinance sets up 3 different kinds of short-term rentals based off zoning districts, whether it is an owner-occupied or whether it's owner-occupied or not, and a number of days rented per calendar year. Looking at Lawrence, the state of Kansas has made a deal with short-term rentals that the company would collect taxes for state and municipalities. Additionally, the City Commission of Lawrence has directed its staff to initiate a code amendment to their city code. And then lastly, looking at what the state of Missouri has done with these. Over the past few legislative sessions, the Missouri legislature has had bills filed limiting cities' ability to regulate short-term rentals. However, none of those bills have passed. In the current session, there is a bill that has been introduced prohibiting cities from creating regulations that expressly prohibit or have the effect of prohibiting short-term rentals, and would prohibit cities from imposing fees that would have the practical effect of prohibiting short-term rentals. However, the proposed bill does note that cities may enact and enforce reasonable zoning standards and can collect transient guest tax on short-term rentals. Additionally, like Kansas, this bill would require companies to collect taxes for the state and municipalities. As mentioned earlier, a working group of staff from multiple departments was formed last year to discuss this issue. The working group discussed with short-term rentals and why their departments have an interest in regulating their use. The working group reviewed current regulations in the code that can be applied to short-term rentals and discussed some amendments that could be proposed to better help regulate short-term rentals. The working group reviewed 4 possible options on how to proceed. First, to enforce current code specifications on a complaint-driven basis. Second, to proactively enforce current code specifications, more or less more proactively enforcing what we have or what we're doing right now. And 3, to amend the code to allow short-term rentals to go unregulated. The last item that we reviewed was to amend and enforce an updated code with revised standards for specific short-term rentals, or specific to short-term rentals. Ultimately, the work group agreed that this would be the way to go. If council were to decide to create new and updated regulations specific to short-term rentals, issues to consider include a definition of a short-term rental, registration and licensing, health and safety inspections, location and zoning districts, parking, the residential character of our neighborhoods, length of stay, occupancy limits, and a level of supervision. So as the staff working group continues to find the best solution, we have reached the point where feedback from council is necessary. Is status quo working? Does council feel that we need more stringent regulations? Do you feel that we need less stringent regulations? And if council would like changes, what regulations are working currently? What regulations need to be changed or added? With that, I will turn to council and welcome your feedback and answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Charlie. Comments or questions from the council? Yes. We'll start with you.
I'd like a definition.
Yeah.
You're putting the cart before the horse here. Tell me what a short-term rental is, or what we want to call it.
Yeah, well, so when you're looking at all those slides, I think what you really need to differentiate is between, you know, the number of rooms being occupied, the number of people allowed into these uses, stuff like that. You know, your traditional bed and breakfast, and I've honestly never been to one, but you can have, I would assume, up to, you know, 5 or 6 rooms that can be rented out that can include, you know, 12 to 15 people.
Right. But we need a definition.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
If the go, or the go-driven, or the driven, is to a level playing field with B&Bs, then that definition has to be somewhere in there.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is, you know, that thing that was the picture of the place that you couldn't find, go rent it. I'm sure they'll have to tell you the address.
Yeah.
This, just like Rental Ready, will grow upon itself once we set the definition and what we want done. But we have to know what it is that we're regulating, and that means shaping it down. You can't take every code that we have and apply it and then come out with nothing. You have to say, this is what we want to regulate. They'll tell, and the information will come just as it did on Red Already, because how many have we got now? Over 900 extra? Yeah. That have come voluntarily or been found. Mm-hmm. And this is be the same situation. Once we define what it is that we're looking for, that would be my.
Okay.
Well, I absolutely am not in favor of the state of Missouri telling us that we can't create our own regulations. I don't think that is a matter of any dispute. agree entirely with Councilmember Van Camp, is we need to establish a definition. These are the types of things that, you know, start small and they grow out of innovation and technology, and you know, and that's great. But there's always unintended consequences, and I'm sure that the folks who are engaging in this are, you know, doing so quite, you know, with good intentions. But when it, you know, has an impact maybe on your neighbors, your neighborhood, and the industry, who is not about, you know, that aren't playing by the same set of rules. And I think that clearly we need to investigate it some more and create some rules and figure out how we're going to compel people to let us know that they're engaging in, you know, this in these short-term rentals. But I think that Councilman is quite correct that our first step is we need to define that, see how it impacts our existing regulations and expectations for our lodging industries and our neighborhoods. Again, Councilman Robertson is, you know, leading up this effort and reaching out to the homeowners associations. If there's covenances within homeowners associations that would specifically prohibit this in their neighborhoods, I think that's something we would want to know. I haven't heard, I mean, and maybe other council people have, and maybe staff has, I have not heard anybody contacting me complaining that their neighbor, you know, that somebody in their neighborhood is doing this. Maybe they don't know that that's what it is, you know. But I mean, I do think that people need to, you know, have some protection from people that they don't know, just, you know, staying in their neighborhood at the house next door, especially if the owner of the home isn't there. There's a lot to unpack for sure, but I think just creating a definition is certainly the first step, and moving on from there and looking at some of our neighbors and what they have done. And certainly, I don't know, and maybe Ms. Palmer is tracking that legislation more closely. There's a lot of bills to keep track of. It's not one that we've paid particular attention to, other than sort of interest. It doesn't appear to me that it has much momentum, but it's certainly not one that we've been actively involved with, that I'm aware of, but something that we've certainly been keeping an eye on. Is that accurate to say? Okay. Anything else? Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to make a couple comments too. And I agree with both of you that probably because things are developing with Airbnbs and this type of new business, that we need to look at some sort of way to at least be aware or regulate to the extent that there's safety. Safety maybe for parking off-street, parking. Maybe there needs to be some safety so that we know that those people renting their homes have liability insurance in case there is an emergency or a problem as a result of the people staying there. How they handle the trash, because it's going to generate a lot more trash for that residential place. As the mayor said, I don't know whether some of our HOAs, homeowner associations, have covenants and restrictions barring the rental of private residences. Most of them are very strict as far as it being a single family dwelling. And so some of the HOAs may have significant more restrictions than even we would want. But that's their prerogative as well. And that's something maybe they should be looking at as well, not just the city. But I think it's a fair statement to say that we as a city need to be looking at this. I'm not really aware that there's been hardly any in Independence, and there usually isn't unless there's reasons for significant numbers of people to come to a community, like a big golf tournament. Yeah, the World Series, certain
I think it's
big
more
events.
than we know, than we might first think. I mean, I've used these services when I've traveled other places, and I'm not going for a big event. It's just that sometimes it's a more affordable option than a hotel, especially if you're traveling to a major metropolitan area. I think some people do treat it like a bed and breakfast. They like the charm and the uniqueness of it. They want, you know, certain amenities. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why it's attractive, and I think that there's probably more of it than we might suspect.
I think you're right, Madam Mayor, members of the council. You know, remember what Mr. DeSalle stated at the beginning, that really the impetus for this was that we were contacted by the Hotel Motel Alliance, who sees this as a competitive issue. This is an unlicensed business operating in your community. And I say that not with any judgment, but rather to say that's been an important priority of the council to try to get a grasp on that. And I think we also want to make sure that this doesn't become a problem down the road as we continue to grow the attractive, desirable nature to visit Independence with what this council's doing with our historic sites, with our event center, all of that. We wouldn't want residents to all of a sudden have a neighbor who rents out their property and has some sort of blowout party for the weekend and stuff without any kind of restrictions around that. So I think we are trying to exercise some foresight, but we're also trying to respond to that important partner in the Hotel Motel Alliance.
My only comment, Charlie, what used to drive me crazy when I was on Planning Commission was that I never saw the city as my partner in promoting development. I always saw the city as throwing up roadblocks. Let's not make roadblocks here. We have got a great history. We are Independence, Missouri with Harry Truman. I don't think we have enough bed and breakfasts. Mm-hmm. And so I don't want to go overboard. I understand the existing bed and breakfasts. They don't want the competition with some person who's just doing it every once in a while. But that person every once in a while is important in our city. Mm-hmm. And we should not hold them to a $500 permit fee. We've really got to balance this. And so I don't want to give you direction tonight to do this one thing. I think it's too soon. I don't think we've really studied it. Mm-hmm. I'm tired. We've been here a couple hours. Yeah. So I don't have any suggestion other than let's balance it.
Come back with some specific suggestions. I know you've got some here. Yeah. But even some more for us to discuss, maybe some options, maybe a list of 10 things, each of them with options.
And I agree. I mean, I don't want to prevent growth and business, and I certainly don't want to prevent visitors from coming to town, but I also think that we owe it to our existing businesses mm-hmm. to not let other people you know, not have to meet the same requirements that they do. They've paid their permits, they've paid their fees, they get their inspections, they do these things. You know, same with rental ready. I mean, one of the impetuses with rental ready is why are some business people allowed to operate in our city without having to follow the same rules as other business people? This is a business venture. I mean, it is a hospitality aspect, but people are doing it to, you know, it's an opportunity for them to bring in some income, show off our city. I mean, as I said, there's a lot of positive things about these short-term rentals, and I certainly don't want to discourage it, but I also think that we have to keep in mind our bed and breakfasts, our inns up on the square, our smaller, and I don't think it's a fear of competition. I just think it's a fairness issue that we want to make sure that, and maybe we look at all of that industry differently and reevaluate some of the requirements that we have for our smaller lodging establishments, independent lodging establishments.
I think, Mayor, if I could suggest this, I think the council is wired a lot like me, where you respond better to seeing something on paper. So maybe what we could do, what I hear you saying is that while we want to get a grasp on these industries, we don't want to be so restrictive that we don't even allow for them to operate in our community. So maybe what we could do is using that very wide range of thought, begin to draft some potential ordinance changes and bring those to the council for further refining until we end up with a product we're happy with.
Restrictive, never mind. I was trying to get some gap in here. Go right ahead. What are we doing?
Yeah.
Get me a definition.
Yeah.
Restrictive, restrictives. We can't do anything till we know what we're doing it with. But having had you take advantage of this and know what it is, and basically it's the homeowner who's going to have to assume this. Well, what they're saying is, I live here, I'm letting somebody else live here, but I'm taking responsibility. That's where the emphasis is going to go. But until we have a definition, we don't have anything. Give it a name.
Yes, Councilman.
One last comment. It occurred to me that one of the things we heard discussing rental ready was that, yeah, the city has codes, but it only applies to private residences on the outside of the home. But now with rental ready, the rental units are inspected inside. And why don't we inspect private homes? Well, in this case, perhaps we need to make sure some safety issues are there. Maybe the smoke detector is working. There's not an oversupply of plugs in the electrical outlet. But those safety things may be part of a new code then that would at least apply to safety for these types of rental units, since we don't inspect private homes and are not planning to in the future. But it is a difference. It is a difference that, that we haven't considered before. So,
I think it's too soon for an ordinance, Mr. City Manager. Sorry. I really do. I really do.
Okay, is there, council prefer we just table this matter for the time being?
Well, I would say have the
Okay.
committee continue to meet. I mean, the task force that's been discussing this, and maybe, you know, kind of with the suggestions you've heard tonight, you know, start looking at this, look at, as more cities engage in this, I mean, certainly keep an eye on the state. And I think it's something that we don't need to decide tonight if we're going to do something or not do something. I think, you know, you've been given some feedback that we can take it back to the committee that's been meeting and have them, you know, continue to meet and bring back recommendations based on this. I mean, it's coming. I mean, it's here. It's coming. It's going to grow. We, as you say, we don't want it to wake up someday and it's, you know, and we're trying to reel it back in. So I would encourage the group to continue to keep going and looking into this
And we can certainly see what
refining it.
comes
Yeah.
out of the Springfield meeting tonight, how their ordinance evolves, all of that. And okay, thank you.
I know we're all tired as we've been here a long time. I just have one other thing though, and I'm sorry, Mr. City Manager, I sort of didn't prepare anybody for this, but it's not that big of a deal. But we certainly, and now that spring is hopefully upon us, yeah. I mean, our trash and litter problem just, you know, continues to be a big concern for our citizens. I've had an opportunity to participate in some listening sessions, forums, different things going on, and it's something that continues to irritate our community and certainly this council. I wish I had an answer to it. I don't. I mean, none of us do, or else we would be doing it. But, you know, a lot of suggestions are made about things that could happen. Primarily, the one that comes up most frequently is community service. And we don't need to get into all of the Senate Bill 5572 about, you know, our limitations as using community service as a penalty for minor violations. My feeling personally has long been that community service isn't free labor. Somebody needs to, they need to be supervised, they need to be protected, they need to, you know, all those things. But maybe we could begin with putting together sort of a report, so to speak, of what measures we have taken, or maybe a bit of a FAQ about, and I don't want to say these are why all your suggestions won't work. That's not my point in saying, but, you know, and maybe further exploring some of the ideas that we've heard and see if they're, if we could revisit some of those. I mean, I really don't know the answer other than, as Councilmember DeLucy said recently, I mean, lead by example, pick up trash, don't litter. But we have a major problem, especially in our right-of-way, where it's one thing to pick up, you know, trash out of your yard or your neighbor's yard, but when we're talking about, you know, the medians and along our state highways and at our bus stops, we shouldn't expect our citizens and our business owners to go out and pick up trash along the side of I-70 and 291. The cleanup that we had last year with the Chamber of Commerce was great. I know they're planning another one, but it's a temporary feel good, and it doesn't really solve the long-term problem. Maybe it inspires some people who participate in those to be more cognizant of the trash and litter that they create. But no, in all of our efforts to create a quality city, we need to find more effective solutions.
So you would like a report that would then either document measures we have taken or
Yes.
ideas that we've considered and?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So we can, you know, provide our citizens who inquire, who make you know, it's like, you know, what have we explored? How can we present? You know, we've explored this option, and this is, you know, why it may or may not be effective. You know, I'm just trying to communicate that we can see that there's a problem, and we're not, you know, satisfied with the appearance of our community, but some of the, there's complications to some of the solutions that are offered.
May I also suggest that we utilize the management analyst in this regard to also look at best practices that other communities have maybe undertaken?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I know that we have looked at that in the past, and I know I had given Kristen a look at some cities. Here's the reality. Most of them have municipal trash service. I mean, when you have your own sanitation department, there are things that we need to find cities that don't have their own sanitation department to compare to. And yes, I think it would be fine, you know, Jordan, I mean, we've reached out to National League of Cities, to all kinds of people to try to find some best practices, but let's kind of reinvigorate that effort and look for cities that are like us, because many of those who've done an effective job of tackling that do it with their own sanitation department.
Certainly.
So, anything else?
Nothing tonight, thank you.
No? Okay, we're adjourned. I have it.